Hello once again, everyone. So now we've gone over pretty much all of the longsword guards. We haven't touched on all of them, of course, because there are so many guards, but generally they all fall into some form of what we've covered. So I figure it's time we move on to a different weapon. And so for now, we're going to talk about, not necessarily rapier specific, but just in general, this will help me cover most of the next couple guards we're going to talk about. So those guards are Prima, Secunda, Terza, and Corta, also known as Prime, Second, Tierce, and Quart. Depends upon the language. So the one I am more familiar with is the Italian terminology. However, I have done a little bit of French smallsword, so it's familiar. You may also know it just by its numbers, which is pretty much all they boil down to, right? First, second, third, fourth. So for now, I'll just use those terms. You may know them by other names. But we're going to cover, obviously we're covering 4 guards instead of just 1, but there aren't really any variations. I mean, there are a couple here and there, but there aren't really as many variations, so this shouldn't be a terribly long video. So, first and foremost, what do they all have in common? They all have the point directly in the middle. Even Prima is going to have the tip directly in the middle, not canted off to the side. This doesn't quite turn into a hanging guard / St. George. Doesn't turn into that yet. It's just straight down the middle, just now you've raised your guard up. So what is your first position? How do you get there? So it can come in handy in a couple different ways. Firstly, it does raise your arm up out of the way. It is very good at defending you from cuts to the head, which is the main thing that you're going to be using it from. Regardless of which position I'm in, if a cut comes from my head, I am best moving into Prime / Prima to defend myself. Not that you can't get away with some other parries, but generally that's what's recommended. Because it sets you up very nicely for a follow-up cut or what have you, or even a follow-up thrust. The other reason that this is often the first position is because if you draw your sword, that's where you're going to be first. There isn't really a way to do the drawing like I talked about with a rapier. Smallsword, maybe, but generally you're going to be drawing up like this to defend yourself, then moving in. So, how do you launch attacks out of Prima? Well, generally, you can turn it into anything. When it comes to most attacks, you're always going to be moving into another position. So for example, I could go from Prima into Corta. I go from Prima into Secunda. Not terribly difficult, just depends upon what my opponent gives me. However, particularly when it comes to using a dagger, or even just your offhand, Prima has a unique little advantage in that it leaves you very open, which means that people are generally a little bit more willing to take the bait. If a thrust comes in, you can very easily use either the dagger, cloak, buckler, or even your empty hand to defend your middle and then launch out a thrust. That's a combo I've used a lot for a very long time, and even against people who know better, I still do occasionally pull it off, so it's a good one. And all you do for that is just come into guard, regardless of, if you're doing the rearward stance, you could even do forward stance, you could even do, just sort of standard stance, doesn't matter. You just have your hand up and ready. The opponent comes in, move it across your body with an open palm to defend, then just take that opening. And you want to just parry the tip. You don't want them to be close enough that they can get more of their blade onto you, because then you'll have more difficulty moving it to the side. So that's pretty much what Prima does. Defends your head against cuts, and it allows for that as well as being able to launch general attacks. Nothing crazy. Secunda, second. Now, as a right-handed person fighting right-handed people, Secunda is generally only going to be used in actions where you've gone outside of your usual presence. So, as we've talked about with longsword and things like that, generally you want to be lined up with your core on your open side. And as we are standing right foot forward, if you're a right-handed person, that means most of the time you're going to be in Corta. However, as another right-handed person is in Corta, you may find yourself moving into Secunda to launch a lot of follow-up techniques, the same way that we would enter in with a cut and then step up with a cut from our non-dominant side as a second action. So its name is kind of apt in 2 ways. If you're fighting a left-handed person, Secunda is going to be your saving grace. So make sure that you practice having a strong one. Now, to form Secunda, don't stick your arm all the way out to the side. Instead, just turn so your nails are down and make sure that it's still about level with how things should be. You don't want your arm fully extended, that's too tiring. Instead, there's a slight bend in my arm, and it's just defending me like so. Now, A lot of times you can actually catch a left-handed person unaware with Secunda. So you just hang out in Terza/Tierce. They launch a thrust from their dominant side to my dominant side over my sword. I can just turn it over and catch that thrust with my guard. And this actually leads into the idea of doing a different lunge for Secunda. So you will see the lunge portrayed a couple different ways depending upon what source you're studying. I'm mostly focusing on Rapier right now, but either way, when it comes to lunging to the inside, I will generally lunge like this. When it comes to lunging, making seconds, so to the outside, I will generally lunge like this instead. The reason I'm doing that is that brings more of my core up and reinforces this particular parry. I fought a lot of left-handers with Rapier as well, and I found this really helps. So if you're having difficulty making your Secunda stronger, all you do to launch that is you are just going to lunge exactly the same as you normally would, but instead of opening, think about bringing this shoulder and this hip forward to really emphasize. I often even sometimes find my hand goes against my bicep, not actually pushing, just it touches. And if I can do that comfortably, that's about where I want to be. So, as for your general defenses, of course, if someone cavaziones or ducks under or disengages underneath your blade and goes for a thrust on this side, you're going to turn into Secunda with your true edge to launch a follow-up thrust. You generally don't want to get into the habit of trying to parry with your false edge. Not that you can't get away with it, just remember, as with longsword, defending this way still leaves you pretty open. Turning your true edge against it closes things off and makes you a lot safer. So, some sources even just say basically Secunda and Prima are a fuss, so I'm talking about Capoferro specifically here. He says they're pointless, that you don't need them. You should. You should still train them, because when they come up, they're very important. Now, Terza/Tierce. It's kind of the neutral position, I guess you could say. Not that you can't do things out of it, just that you don't really do things specifically out of it. Sometimes there will be reference to lunging specifically in Tierce or Terza, so not turning to one side or the other and just launching your attack. It's 6 1/2 really. But most times you are advised to stay in Terza, so not to dictate to one side or the other, and that way you can very easily come up on the outside of someone's blade, turn to Secunda, or instead come up to the inside of someone's blade and move into Corta. So it's a good neutral position to be in that doesn't really give anything away. And especially if you're newer, you may be into the habit of just hanging out in, if you're a right-hander, Corta all the time. I used to do it. But Terza, quite useful for just being a neutral sort of position. Now, we come to Corta. Now, Corta, if you're a right-hander, is going to be your main guy. All you do to form Corta is you just turn your nails upward. So we're here. Once again, I'm not moving my arm all the way out to the side. I'm just lining it up with my body as I normally would. Now, generally, it's going to be, for example, I'm here, I find the opponent's sword, I launch a thrust, very comfortable. Some sources will show the hand being raised up more on the thrust, some will show it being more just in line with the head. I like to keep it in line with the head, blade will flex on them. Right? There is even a form of low Corta or low cart that is used in some parries for Smallsword or other sources. It can come up here and there as a defense of the leg, or alternatively as a thrust low, so that does appear. But just like with Secunda, it's just same idea, slightly different plane of motion. Now, Corta, like I said, is going to be your main guy. You're going to be using him a lot. You find the sword, you launch a thrust, alternatively someone thrusts on your dominant side, boom, there's your counter thrust, or parry, riposte, all that great stuff. Pretty much standard. The trick with it is don't get stuck in it. Don't forget about your other guards, because variety can really be the name of the game in such a limited amount of options. Now between those two, there is also kind of a third option, not a third option, a fifth option, which is between the two. It's between Terz and it's between Corta. It's right about here. Alfieri specifically talks about this, and he mentions it as being his grand invention. It's really kind of whatever. The idea being that it is sitting between those two positions, so it kind of has the advantages of being not as dictated to one side as Terza is, but also having the strength to move into Corta very quickly. And you can do most things that you would do in Corta from here. So all you do for that is hold Terza, just turn to about a 45, and he's there for you. So, not a ton of guards, not a ton of crazy actions to do out of them, but that's because they're really, it's not that there aren't, it's that for the most part they just branch off of these 4 and moving in between these 4, sometimes 5. So, otherwise though, that's a basic overview of prima, secunda, terza, quarta, or 1, 2, 3, 4. Depending upon whatever system you're working on, they may have slightly different names, but they all do generally those things. So, practice with them, play with them, and we'll talk about some other guard transitions and things like that another time.